Welcome to our program on the Green New Deal and beyond with scientist and author Stan Cox. I'm Catherine Bunton. Jim, am I on? Thank you. I'm Catherine Bunton. Jack Kelly and I are the co-chairs of the Chicago Area Peace Action Climate Group. We meet monthly to address the climate crisis we face, work on solutions at the local, at state, and federal levels. So we do advocacy and public education events like this one. We lobby our elected representatives, and we go to the streets with our youth groups in leadership on this issue, groups like Sunrise and Extinction Rebellion. When we read the Green New Deal and beyond, we realized that Cox is offering an analysis that we are not hearing in our mainstream media, and that can and should help us to shape our messages and demands going forward. We know that one of the important roles of grassroots organizing is to change the narrative in the public square and focus on the truth as we see it. We want to applaud our 11 dynamic co-sponsors of this webinar. Each of these organizations is doing important work, and we will be following tonight's program with an email that includes actionable ideas for your consideration and the contact information for each co-sponsor. These groups are always growing, so they need our volunteer hours and our financial support to do their work. After the interview with Dr. Cox, we hope to have a good discussion with all of you. Please put your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We won't be using the chat tonight. Recalling Greta Thunberg's admonition, unless you start focusing on what needs to be done instead of what is politically possible, there is no hope. I think you will see how aligned this book is with that message. Now I have the privilege of turning over our program to Jerome McDonnell, our longtime friend and esteemed host of World View. We are grateful to have you, Jerome, to guide us through this discussion tonight. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Catherine. And it's really great to be here with you and with Peace Action again and all the friends you have. And I've met and known over the years. And congratulations to you for doing this and bringing this book to people's attention and getting people to think a couple steps ahead rather than just what's out there right now. And I think people will get a lot out of this conversation today. The conversation is about Stan Cox's book, The Green New Deal and Beyond, Ending the Climate Emergency While We Still Can. There's a nifty introduction by Noam Chomsky. And I'll let you know a little about Stan. He's a scientist with a PhD in plant breeding who began his career at the US Department of Agriculture as a wheat geneticist. And for over 20 years, Cox was the lead scientist at the Land Institute, where he did research on creating a perennial version of the grain sorghum. And he's now a research scholar in ecosphere studies at the Land Institute. And The Green New Deal and Beyond is not Stan's first book. His previous books are Losing Our Cool, Uncomfortable Truths About Our Air-Conditioned World, and Any Way You Slice It, The Past, Present, and Future of Rationing. And Stan's already working on another book, and the book in the works that's about to come out is The Path to a Livable Future, A New Politics to Fight Climate Change, Racism, and the Next Pandemic. It's great to be with you, Stan Cox. Take yourself off.
Thank you, Jerome.
And, you know, I think when people think about the Green New Deal, it's in recent months, it's just been such a relief to have the ideas behind the Green New Deal be accepted. The new presidency of Joe Biden seems to be ready to incorporate these ideas of the Green New Deal into the infrastructure bill. The idea equating equity and climate justice is widely accepted now, and people seem to want to really move forward with this. Most people who want to do things about climate change. So a lot of really good things seem to have happened with the Green New Deal and right now. How good should we feel about all this?
Well, it's a lot of progress, but compared with the past 30 years in which we've let time go by, let greenhouse gases build up in the atmosphere, and have done very little, neither we nor other countries. Yet we don't, since we don't have legislation or a plan, a fully fleshed out plan, either based on the Green New Deal or on the Biden administration, which are quite similar. It's hard to say how good this is, but I think what we can say is that what we have is the green part and the New Deal part, and the New Deal part has what has really generated most of the energy and excitement in the climate movement. The climate justice provisions, good jobs to replace jobs in the dirty industries, social safety nets. All of these things are very welcome. On the other hand, the green part is where there's a deficiency. Of course, there's the buildup of renewable energy infrastructure and electric grid and a lot of decarbonization technology and so forth, which is all very much needed. But there is no plan for getting rid of fossil fuels. There have been proposals for banning drilling on federal land, getting rid of subsidies and so forth. But we have plans in the works right now in this country for 250 or so new natural gas fired power plants to be built and 500 pipeline projects. The fossil fuel industry isn't going anywhere. The assumption that building a lot of renewable energy infrastructure is going to just through market forces drive fossil fuels out of the economy is not consistent with history or research, in which usually new sources of energy in a growth economy simply add to the total amount of energy and don't displace older sources.
Let's talk about that for a second. Let's because that's an interesting point, because I think everybody is basing their assumptions on renewables, are pushing out coal right now, and we're gonna, and the next it's gonna come to natural gas, and as soon as we push those renewable growth things up, it's gonna knock out the fossil fuels.
Well, that's the perception, but most of the reduction of the use of coal has come with increased use of natural gas in power plants. Meanwhile, in the use of natural gas in generating electricity is only 17%, I think, of the total use of natural gas. So there's still all of the use in space heating, water heating, cooking, et cetera, which is pretty huge. So we don't really, we're not really seeing a decrease in the total use of fossil fuels. And the I think it's J.P. Morgan, they're forecasting that by 3035, natural gas, the reduction in the use of natural gas is only going to be about 13% below today if we keep on as we are without doing something to directly flush fossil fuels out of the economy.
And there are a lot of interesting things going on with natural gas now. A lot of states are making restrictions against going after natural gas in new buildings and things. We're seeing legislation that says you cannot stop a new building from having natural gas. They want them all to have it. So there is some movement on natural gas. There's some attention that's being drawn to it, but there is absolutely zero plan. That we're in Illinois. We're still building new pipelines. The legislature just approved a new natural gas pipeline to a community called Pembroke that does not really want it, and they want renewables. They don't want a natural gas pipeline, but they're still building them. It's a funny thing. I think a lot of people on this call might be familiar with Mark Jacobson from Stanford University, who's done some reports on us getting to 100% renewables. And, he has some pretty detailed reports about how we're going to get there and why we can get there. And I think so many people base their hope on us getting to 100% renewable and just pushing out to that. You outline a bunch of restrictions to that, a bunch of obstacles that we would face. What kind of flaws did you see in the kind of analysis that Jacobson's putting out there?
Well, I'm not an expert in this area, but relying on research by folks, experts around the world, it seems that the projections by Jacobson and others make a lot of highly optimistic assumptions, for one thing, both about how rapidly we're going to improve efficiency at historically unprecedented rates and build up of renewable energy at very high, unprecedented rates, as well as in some of their studies, an over-reliance on hydroelectric power, which has a lot of its own ecological problems. When you extend this, because they've also published papers on supplying the entire world with renewable energy, and 100% of the energy supply being renewable. But in those cases, they have kind of frozen in place the huge disparities in energy access around the world, so that in the United States, we would still have a supply of almost 10,000 watts per capita, whereas the average for South Asia would be about 500, about 1/20th of that, in South America, about 1,400. Because if you really wanted to supply the entire world with the amount of energy that we consume in this country, with renewable energy, just the solar part, leaving aside the wind part, the solar part would occupy as much land as all agriculture and human settlement across the globe. So it would be, and that's a large percentage of the land surface of the planet. So there are a number of problems with it.
You have a kind of similar analysis with electric cars, and that if we all were to have electric cars tomorrow, it clearly would be a better for the greenhouse gas emissions, but there's all sorts of other problems that would result, and the battery situation is one you do some analysis of too, and with the minerals and whatnot. It's not that, we're pretty optimistic about it now, and it seems exciting to see Joe Biden driving an electric car and stuff, but it may not be as rosy as all that.
Yes, it appears to me that if we're going to get control of the climate situation, that we cannot have a fleet of, I think, 250 million private vehicles in this country. The use of the private vehicle has got to decrease. The electric car issue, it has several issues involving both the energy that if we count the emissions just from driving the car, then they're much lower. We have to add the greater emissions in manufacturing the cars, but even more important than that are the metallic elements, lithium, particularly for the batteries, and cobalt and other metals that are, it's going to raise the worldwide demand for those and other ores to the point that we're going to see probably as much of a kind of global rush on metals as we've seen over the past century on fossil fuels, with all of the geopolitical turmoil that's involved, and the terrible ecological and humanitarian situation in places in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in South America, China, and other places, because the bulk of all of these ores lie outside our borders. So we're going to be as dependent on supply lines from around the world for this as we were on the Persian Gulf in the fossil fuel era.
Yeah, wars for our electric cars is something I wouldn't look forward to. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about what we, if these things are not as rosy as everyone thinks they are, what is the thing that we do to get our greenhouse gases down? You mentioned how much more energy Americans consume than every other society. Roll that out for us a little more and tell us like where we could go. I mean, people talk about, well, if we were just more efficient, we would do better. But it may take more than efficiency to bring that number down.
Right, there are strict limits to efficiency because growth in demand is on an exponential curve going like this. So it increases every year. Whereas if you're reducing the amount of emissions per, say, unit of GDP or unit of production, it's going down, but it's never going to get to zero. You can't make something out of nothing. And so it levels out, and eventually growth takes over, and you can't make any more progress. So we have to take other kinds of action to decrease the amount of energy. And there's no reason that we should be using twice as much energy per capita as France, or 4 times as much as Croatia, for example. This extra energy expenditure isn't buying us better quality of life or anything like that. And the energy that we've got to get rid of is the fossil fuel energy, because fossil fuels are responsible for 3/4 of greenhouse emissions. So we can do all we want with land use and meat production, all of those things, which need to be done anyway. But we have to directly attack fossil fuels. And what I have been advocating is to put a hard statutory cap on the number of barrels of oil, cubic feet of gas, tons of coal coming out of the ground and into the economy every year, and ratcheting that cap down fairly rapidly. The UN emissions gap report says we've waited so long that now we need to reduce emissions by 8% every year, which is an astonishing amount. But whatever rate we reduce it at, we have to get the use of fossil fuels down to zero as fast as possible. And we can try all of the demand side things we want, but we have to go right to the source, to the wellhead and the mine, and cut the supply off there.
Now, when you say you would go for a cap on, an ever reducing cap, an annually reducing cap on all fossil fuels, why wouldn't a carbon tax work? Why wouldn't we let itself push itself down? Why not use the kind of tools that we have? The government likes to go in there and kind of use the Clean Air Act, and we'll finagle this, and we'll use the energy, we'll do the miles per gallon of the car will go up. And, do we have to go right to the source and just, what would why not use these other tools?
Well, if we rely on the price of carbon, then we're crossing our fingers and saying, okay, we're hoping that that people are going to react a certain way. And we know that for energy, what economists call the elasticity is not very great. You raise the price for every 10% increase in price, you get about a 1% reduction in consumption. And so when economists have looked at what kind of carbon price would be required to reach the various goals of 1.5 degrees or 2.5 degrees of warming, they're astronomical. None other 2.5 years ago, none other than William Nordhaus, after that, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics, he calculated that if we were to have a policy to just keep warming below 2.5 degrees, which would be catastrophic, it needs to be below 1.5 degrees, it would require a price of carbon, a carbon tax that would, he said, it would be impossible in an economic sense. It would basically destroy the economy. And he said, yeah, he kind of threw up his hands. The other problem with a tax is, of course, that everybody hates taxes, and as well as the other carbon pricing mechanisms like cap and trade. Those are extremely unpopular. But going after the fossil fuel companies, who everybody hates, it would, I think, be a much more popular way to go.
Now, explain that a little more, and what would it mean for people? Wouldn't it end up acting as a tax on them anyway? They would see the price of their energy go up. They would see shortages. They would see bad things happen. What would it look like for the average person?
Well, our and other governments' experience with shortages of resources. In this case, it would be a kind of a voluntarily imposed shortage of fossil fuels, whereas, say, in World War II, it was externally imposed, and because we had to divert fuels to the war effort and so forth. In those times, first of all, you're right that if you have a shrinking supply and the same demand, prices are going to go up. And so that requires the imposition of price controls on in this case, energy, which we had in World War II and we had in the 1970s. But for those of us who were around in the 70s, we know that having gasoline at the same fixed at a reasonable price and a short supply, you had the long lines at gas stations and a lot of social upheaval. So if you impose price controls, then you have to have a mechanism to make sure everybody gets a fair share and gets a sufficient quantity of what they need. And that problem during World War II in this country, UK and others, was solved with rationing. And it did ensure that for fuel, food, and a number of goods, that everybody had enough.
What is the public perception of rationing? I mean, when this happened during World War II, did people hate it? Did it seem like that was not, something that people were bitter about?
Well, Gallup was around back then. They did polling, and in the government was kind of tentative about rationing, and so they were just extending it to this product and then that product, and were kind of worried about this. But the polls showed that people thought the government wasn't going far enough because they were having to stand in long lines for stuff, or they weren't able to get it, and they said we want rationing. Actually extended it, and it remained popular throughout the war, but people, obviously it was kind of a headache for people and so forth. But there was a lot of, for example, people's the overall nutritional status in the country once they instituted food rationing actually improved, because there was a floor. Everybody got a minimum of nutritious foods, and it actually improved.
Now, the whole discussion that we had about climate during the last election campaign, nobody came out and said, hey, let's do us some rationing and really push down things and drive the fossil fuel industry out of business. And there were a lot of different ideas flying around. It seemed like a pretty serious debate, but nobody really brings this up on the political spectrum. How do you, if you want to see this happen, how do you kind of see the conversation going?
Well, first of all, I put it a little differently, because leading with rationing is kind of backwards. The central thing that needs to be done is this cap on the extraction and use of fossil fuels, and phasing out fossil fuels rapidly. And one can point to a proposal that was 10 years ago was debated in the UK Parliament, but was taken seriously by them to do this very thing. It was considered ahead of its time then, but I don't think so now. In fact, I think one thing, the case should be made that as we've been recently informed by the United Nations Emissions Gap Report, that because we've delayed and done nothing between 2010 and now, that the rate at which we've got to get rid of fossil fuels and emissions, that we have to get rid of them at 4 times the annual rate we would have just 10 years ago. So we could have done it at 2% a year back then. Now it's 8%. So I think a lot of these more gradualist proposals, if this were still 1990 when we first became aware of the climate problem, then we'd have a lot of options. But at this point, we're down to very few, and we wait another 10 years and we're sunk. So I think that's the political case that has to be made.
Now, it's interesting to see that there are some ideas out there about the government taking charge and really doing kind of dramatic things. I was reading an article in Vox about the Permian Basin, and there's been a lot of conversation in the New York Times about methane releases and things, and what are we going to do? We got to, tamp this down. And there's a suggestion that Congress, or that the president declare a climate emergency. The congressional legislation that allowed the export of crude oil from the United States has a clause in it that allows the president to suspend exports by declaring a national emergency, and a climate emergency would be a national emergency, and you could basically shut down all expansion of oil in the Permian Basin, and you'd be going to war with the Texas governor and all these fossil fuel companies, and all hell would break loose. But some people are starting to talk about things like that as a measure that the country can take to start taking control and pushing the volume of oil down.
No, I like that idea. In fact, in the book, I called for a ban on exports and imports of fuel, and that should certainly include liquefied natural gas as well, which we're trying to gear up to do. So there are a lot of federal actions that could be taken, and kind of the nuclear option, as it's considered, would be to nationalize the fossil fuel industries, to take them over, have them run by public cooperatives whose business plan would be to go out of business in the next 15 years or so. There's a group called the Democracy Collaborative who published a report last year on it's the feasibility. It's not as outlandish as one would think, especially with the kind of crash of the industry, which is not going to last. They're going to bounce back, but if you did it right now, they could be bought out completely much more cheaply than some of the recovery packages that were, these several $1 trillion recovery packages. Because I don't think they're not going to go out quietly. They would, they're not going to say, we'll put ourselves out of business. So it may come to that.
But what about a hedge fund? Don't you think a hedge fund might put Exxon out of business? A little startup hedge fund has got a few guys on the board of directors now. Is that going to kickstart this thing?
Yes, when I saw that they had gotten a couple of people on the board of Exxon, I thought, well, if we're down to the point where we're depending on hedge funds to bail us out, I think we're in trouble, no matter how socially responsible they are.
I was reading about the people they got on the on the board, and one of the guys was from the George W. Bush administration. He was their clean energy guy, in the George W. Bush administration, who did so much for clean energy. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah, and I think they're former oil executives in that group too.
So their diversification might be a little on the slow side.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't. How do you? I want to ask you a couple more questions about the World War II and the real and other attempts at rationing, and why you think this kind of thing would work today. Because I think everybody who's got a question, there are about 4 questions, and about how do we put this over on people? People don't even think that there's an emergency. We can't even wake people up to pay attention to the you know, the Illinois legislation on energy here just whiffed out because a coal company was able to ram itself into the negotiations and call for an exemption, and the whole bill just didn't pass because this coal company held it up. And nobody seems particularly, you know, enraged about that. There's not a big upset about it, and there's not a, you know, big upset about climate change in general. Most people, there's such a only 26% of the public is alarmed about climate change, according to an opinion poll analyzed by the Yale Project on Climate Change Communications. There just seems to be the equation doesn't seem to be the same with the New Deal, where there was a consensus that there was an emergency, we had to do something, and now there's kind of like, you know, Target's got some solar panels, and then not enough.
Well, I think this is where Chicago area peace action and all of the co-sponsors of this, who I was looking, or, you know, it's fantastic how active and effective y'all are. That that this is it just needs a lot more of this, and the. But now I'm sorry to hear about that poll, because the polls I was hearing about during the last year's election campaign, climate was climbing up to number 2 or number 1 sometimes in people's minds. So I think a lot of that was due to Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion, and the other climate strikes, and all of the action that was going on before the pandemic, and is continuing now. And then I've just this other book I just finished, I wrote in part, and taking heart from the uprising in the streets last summer over systemic racism and related issues, and the huge breadth of the of Americans who rose up on that. And I think, is it going to be one more summer of fires on the West Coast, or floods in Mississippi Valley, or another Hurricane Maria? I don't have a lot of hope that a single disaster is going to do it, but you look at some of the projections of what could happen with just not very much more warming. We don't have time for that to happen to spur people into action, but the more they know about it, the better.
We've got a question that's about President Biden and some of the decisions he's made in the past month. He has said he is going to further expand production and distribution of fossil fuels in Wyoming and federal lands, Alaska on the North Slope, and on the bitterly contested Dakota Access Pipeline. They're going to give it's a green light for the fossil fuel industry to continue drilling on federal lands. It ignores environmental concerns in sensitive areas and indigenous communities. At the same time, President Biden makes a commitment at a virtual climate meeting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030.
Yeah.
What kind of game do you think Biden's playing? Because he certainly, I mean, he was actually the kind of lamest climate candidate in the running, and he adopted a lot of other people's stuff and goosed up his bit. He's got some weaknesses. He wants a little fossil fuel in there.
Yeah, all of that is very internally inconsistent. You can't do both of those things. Like a lot of corporations, it appears that one thing he's doing, he's leaving the door wide open for further nuclear energy development as well. And so, he'll erroneously count that as carbon free. But also, like a lot of nations and countries who are making these, or companies and countries who are making these pledges under the Paris Agreement or corporate pledges or whatever to reach net zero by 2050, which Biden has also said, or those types of pledges, they're imagining huge amounts of carbon capture and storage, which is that's a real shell game. When you hear net zero, think not zero, because there are a lot of problems with this. I don't think we want to get into all the technicalities of it, but it's really the technologies are just not adequate to the job. In fact, the International Energy Agency, which is about one of the most establishment state organizations there is, they said, well, yeah, we can get to net zero or I think we can stay within a degree and a half if we have these historically unprecedented increases in efficiency, and by using some new technologies, and about half of the emissions reduction is going to come from technologies that haven't really been developed yet, but we're going to have them, and that's going to take care of it. And the technologies they're talking about, some of these carbon capture things, are very fanciful and just aren't going to happen.
You mentioned nuclear there and there's a couple questions about nuclear. Do we need nuclear? In Illinois, we're 50% nuclear for our electricity, and the legislature, if they ever pass this energy bill, will pay Exelon, the nuclear provider, a lot of money to keep these plants running, just because they're being basically extorted by Exelon to keep these things running and keep that up while they get some renewable energies going. And the environmentalists back this mostly. And how do we? Warren Buffett and Bill Gates came out with an idea. They're going to put a little nuclear reactor in Wyoming and have the mini nukes are big in Canada, and they can't talk about mini nukes because it helps you with your future grid and having some kind of base load thing. Do you think we really need that kind of nuclear?
Well, for all of the reasons that nuclear energy is a disaster, there should be no new nuclear energy should not be a part of this solution at all. And that's not just me saying that. There was a paper published last year in one of the major journals by a group of experts in nuclear energy, and these were all people who are they've spent their careers trying to develop and promote nuclear energy, and they were throwing their hands up. They were saying, because of the problems with waste and security and disasters, et cetera, no conventional nuclear plants, no more of those are going to be built. It's just not going to happen. But then turning to these newly developing nuclear energy technologies, they said those are not going to be able to be rolled out on a scale to supplant fossil fuels until, at least after 2050, I think they said. Anyway, during the decades when we have to get rid of the fossil fuels, those things are not going to be available, and they're still highly speculative. Now, this discussion of whether to keep using existing nuclear facilities, I'm kind of agnostic about that. If it does prevent increasing the amount of fossil fuels then being burned, then okay, it's probably better than that. But what our focus needs to be on is reducing the quantity of energy that's required to run this society, and at the same time eliminate fossil fuels. And in eliminating fossil fuels will automatically reduce the amount of energy available, and will force us to be innovative in ways to run society on less energy.
There was a question, and we mentioned the carbon tax, but we didn't specifically talk about a carbon fee and dividend approach like the Citizens Climate Lobby has been working on for years. And does that, would a fee and dividend approach, you feel the same way about that as you do about a straight carbon tax?
Well, the fee and dividend resolves one of the problems with the carbon tax, is that a straight carbon tax is highly regressive, because everybody is having to consume energy, and it's a larger part of the budget of low-income people. So you don't want that. The fee and dividend resolves that, because the money goes back. It goes back to the people who've been paying the taxes. And if you have a progressive dividend in which more of it goes back to lower income people, then it can be even more progressive. But it still doesn't solve the problem of the price of carbon required to reduce fossil fuels sufficiently is so huge that it would be, especially for low-income people, that they would be taking this dividend and 1 month spending it all on energy, and they're going to be seeing $10 a gallon gas or whatever, and it's just not going to be. It's going to be kind of crazy. To be progressive, you need to keep the price of energy affordable, and for the climate, you have to have a fair share of energy for everybody.
There's a question about reducing the nation's car fleet and how to do that without a total societal political revolution. And it's interesting because, one of the groups that you're fond of is Climate Mobilization, which has a a lot of ideas along the lines of what you're thinking of. They've put out a detailed victory plan for kind of making the government do stuff and have some sort of capping and rationing of fossil fuels. And the guy who wrote it went to work for kind of left the organization and went to work for a high-speed rail group now. He wants to, he wants to get on board with railways and public transportation and really gear up for a whole different thing.
Yeah. Well, right. Yeah. I mean, the substitute for the private automobile is some form of collective transportation, and that's where we're really built into a corner. Like out here in Salina, Kansas, for example, there's without an automobile, you're pretty much stuck where you are, and there's much of the country like that. And I mean, even in the Chicago area, there's you can't. There are a lot of places where you couldn't possibly rely on public transportation for everything, and so we've got to build that out. We there's no time for that because those kind of projects take years and decades. So it's going to be a problem, but I don't think the solution is to build another 250 million electric vehicles to replace others. And there are some ideas like ride sharing, not like Uber, but having these ride hailing services that would be vans or small buses or automobiles, and it could it's been suggested they be autonomous self-driving ones that work on algorithms and are able to run 24 hours a day and reduce the fleet of vehicles, they say, by 96%. But of course, they're running 24 hours a day, so there's still a lot of energy being burned. But at least there wouldn't be as many vehicles.
And do you want to say something about the climate mobilization and their victory plan?
Yes, I'm not part of that group, but for 5-6 years now, I've been in touch with them, and we've written some things together and so forth. And they mainly because they have as part of that plan, they have a declining cap, like I've been talking about, on fossil fuels, and then they have planning of industrial production, as happened in World War II, to fit the energy supply and to make sure that essential production goes forward, and that production that is either wasteful or superfluous and so forth doesn't happen, to make sure there's enough for everybody. And then they kind of used my rationing book in their in the rationing energy rationing plan that they put forward. But I don't know, as you say, the author of that that report is not with them now, and so I don't know how much they're pushing it. And the author of that British report for doing this also has moved on, and so that that's why I've been trying to push to keep this idea alive and get get more heft behind it.
There's a question about fossil fuel risk bonds. And this is a concept devised by Professor John Talberth. And he wants to require fossil fuel companies to purchase bonds up front to pay to clean up the messes they've left behind with the abandoned fracking wells, oil wells, coal mines. And he wants them to require to buy bonds up front to pay for the costs that the climate crisis brings. And he suggests that such bills could be passed at the local, state, or federal level. Would that do something to kind of bring the edge off the climate crisis?
Well, I'm all for doing that, but it's going to be suffer from the same problems as a carbon tax in reducing in its attempts to reduce greenhouse emissions, because the fossil fuel companies are very good at incorporating costs like this into their cost of doing business. It's not going to stop them from extracting and selling fossil fuels. It may make it more painful, and it could even, if the cost of buying those bonds is high enough, it might make them, it might make them just give up the business. But I don't think that that's it, as much as I would like to see the companies have to deal with the consequences of what they're doing, and as much as this, once again, if it were 30 years ago, there might have been time for a strategy like this to contribute to reducing fossil fuel use, but it's too late now, I'm afraid.
Dave Kraft has a question here, and it's about the mindset and that we need to make this kind of change. And he says, as a former community mental health professional, I continue to be amazed that serious consideration is not paid to the addiction aspect of both our energy use and the mindless, rampant consumerism that drives its need. And the absence of the professional expertise of social scientists is shocking. Do you see a role for social scientists in getting at the numerous human factors like motivation, perception, denial, plus addiction? What would it be like to have social scientists helping us along to break our mindset? And I got to say, I ride my bike. I've been riding my bike all the time to work, to train to work. I live in the suburbs of Chicago, and I have a bicycle that has an old kind of burly child thing. And I take it to the store and I get all my groceries and I come back, and there's absolutely nobody else doing this in the suburbs of Chicago. The parking lot is just full of cars. Nobody, and nobody even asks me about it. They just look at me and they don't even say anything. It's like, this guy's so weird, I can't even talk to him, or no one has ever even would care to change their behavior and try to do something like this. Is there a behavioral problem here that needs addressing?
Yes, and I welcome all social scientists and cognitive scientists and so forth to please help us with this. In fact, one of the co-founders of the Climate Mobilization, and who is still the director, I believe, Margaret Klein Solomon, is a psychologist, and she has written a book about this subject. It's absolutely essential, and once again, it's a case of where, where the intervention has to happen, because I don't think that we can, one person at a time, or even even through education. At this point, it's hard to see how minds can be changed until the circumstances are changed. And as I was saying, I don't think the visible, tangible evidence of climate disruption is going to become strong enough to change people's motivation. And so I hope that that a groundswell on climate will capture people's imagination, as Black Lives Matter has shown it can happen. And the one little bit of social science research I know about, that I cited in one of these books, is these tipping points, and that you don't have to convince the entire population, or 3/4 of the population, that they going through a lot of things through history. They estimated that time and again, it seems that around 25% of the population is where ideas can take hold and go. I don't know if, for example, gay marriage was one of those, but we've seen a number of these things over time. Just suddenly, a legalization of weed, that it's something that nobody accepts, and then a bunch of people accept, and then suddenly it's not an issue anymore, and it happens. So I'm not a wild-eyed optimist. I'm not predicting that's going to happen with climate, but it gives us some hope, I guess.
What kind of lifestyle do you think people should anticipate in the future? And you talk a bit in the book about, how people in the upper third of the echelon here in this country are going to, have to make some sacrifices. And how far does this go? There is a question about the Amish here, and they like, the questioner likes the Amish and thinks they set an example with their land usage, their horsepower, their off the grid, their solar panels, their buggy lights. They use windmills to pump water, and this, we don't ever consider living a Amish or semi-Amish lifestyle. That would seem crazy, but if we're going to lead a low energy lifestyle, how low do we have to go?
Well, there for a long time has been a movement started in Switzerland called the 2000 Watt Society, and they have been saying that in the affluent countries that we could, I think, Switzerland lives on more than that, but there are a number of countries around the world that are perfectly good countries to live in and have a good quality of life, that live at about that level. But they're saying that, say, 1/5 of the quantity of energy we use, that could be satisfactory. But our problem is our built environment and our transportation systems are built for the 10,000 watt society, and where it seems to me that if we are going to spend $2 or $4 or $6 trillion on infrastructure and other things, that it should go to a total overhaul of cities and rural areas, and having cities where you don't, and rural areas where you don't have to have a vehicle, and where people live close to their work, and where there's lots of green space, all of these things. I wrote that book about air conditioning. This is the biggest impediment to reducing the huge amount of energy we spend just on air conditioning, as we built these steel and concrete areas that are uninhabitable without air conditioning. So, but again, those are things that we're not going to do unless there is some limit put on what we can do. There, having a cap, having these policies will, I think, stimulate a lot of innovation, a lot of ideas, and the ones that, as long as you don't have to worry about how much resources are available, that people aren't going to think about it.
And I don't know if people know what a great global leader we are in air conditioning, but how big a difference would it make if we did turn off our air conditioners and things?
Well, it's something like 400, I think 400 million tons of carbon dioxide a year from air conditioning. And that's equivalent, because with air conditioning, you have not only the energy to run the power plants to supply the air conditioning systems, but there are also the refrigerants, which are greenhouse gases. But the real problem is that we have introduced the world to air conditioning. And so now, especially in China and India, but in the Middle East and other places too, the quantity of air conditioning, the annual increase in the amount of air conditioning being used would, within a couple of decades, it's estimated it would, if it happened, it would be like 50% of the world's total electricity supply now would be devoted to air conditioning alone. But the problem is we don't have the moral standing to lecture the world about how you better not do that. You're going to ruin the planet, when we're going to be using more and more as the world heats up.
I wanted to ask you a question about agriculture too, and there's you are a plant breeder and have spent your life in that world. But yet you go after the fossil fuel companies. Is our land use, is sustainable agriculture, is our diet? I mean, how do you feel about those things in comparison to the fossil fuels?
I'm glad you asked that, Jerome, because I have only recently been doing this work on fossil fuels, and before that, my whole career was spent, and I still am working in area of agriculture and land use, which, next to fossil fuels, is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And we have, as I was saying, about 3/4 of emissions coming from fossil fuels, and a large share of the rest of it is, though, from land use, and the bulk of that is agriculture and forestry. And what I have been saying is that that cutting emissions from land use, and especially agriculture, is something what we have to do to reduce those emissions, all of those actions are including both plant and animal raising, are things that we should have been doing and are increasingly are doing for a long time for other reasons, in saving our soils and our waters and biodiversity. That's the classic win-win situation there. Whatever you're doing for the sake of soils and biodiversity is also going to help sequester carbon in the ground, and it's going to reduce the carbon emissions from practicing agriculture. But here in the past couple of years, I've moved over to the other side of the Land Institute and have been dealing with fossil fuels, because we can accomplish all of that and have totally reform agriculture, and still 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions would not be dealt with. So we're now trying to deal with both issues.
I wanted to ask some about your book that's in the works, The Path for a Livable Future, A New Politics to Fight Climate Change, Racism, in the Next Pandemic. It sounds like you're just doing the next chapter from the book you did.
Well, the Green New Deal and Beyond was, its publication date was May of last year, 2020, right as the first wave of the coronavirus was cresting, and then and then we went into the summer and the racial reckoning, and so yeah, I guess you're right in a way, because the editor at City Lights called and said, okay, it's time for a follow-up, because the world is changing very quickly here, and how do we account for these things? But what I hope is that whereas the Green New Deal and Beyond, people have found it troubling and shocking, maybe pessimistic, although I tried not to make it that way. The path to a livable future, I think, is more hopeful and focusing on the people and groups and communities who we can look to help lead us down that path, because I'm not an expert. I don't know anything. So it's mainly looking to especially to marginalized communities and indigenous communities, and for example, the people, some of the people who have paid the worst price during the pandemic, including migrant farm workers who managed to keep the supply of food going at the risk of their own lives and the neglect and abuse of the people employing them. And the tradition of mutual aid in communities around America and the world, and the environmental justice movement, who have, a lot of this has not been in the forefront in climate policy, and more so now with the pipeline battles and so forth, especially in indigenous people. But we I think that more and more we're all going to have to work together on all these problems have to be tackled simultaneously.
Well, maybe one last question, and is there any country that you see that is really taking the bull by the horns and kind of considering the kind of actions that you're talking about, that really wants to ratchet its carbon down in the method that you're describing? Because it seems like Germany's gotten pretty high with their renewable rates and things without any rationing, and they're doing pretty well. But I did notice that France the other day decided to abolish domestic air flights on routes that can be covered by train in under 2.5 hours as they seek to lower carbon emissions. So they like went right out and banned short flights. That's something. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a leader out there?
I don't know that it's all shades of gray, especially among affluent countries. And my son lives in Copenhagen, and Denmark has been able to report days where all 100% of their electricity is being supplied by wind. But then on the other hand, they are using, they're generating the bulk of their kind of continuous load of electricity with these wood pellets and with municipal waste, which is putting that carbon back into the atmosphere. So I don't know. I think we have to turn to some of the less affluent countries. Costa Rica is often held up as a good example. Despite all the turmoil, there's what's called the Buen Vivir movement in Bolivia and other South American countries. The good life movement that doesn't depend on material wealth and is has a lighter environmental footprint. But I'm afraid, I hope that if there's ever going to be one of those good examples, maybe we can be it, but we're not yet.
Well, Stan Cox, it's been a pleasure talking with you and thinking some of these things through. And I think we've given, hopefully people a lot of food for thought and a lot of food for action when it comes to the next steps. And Jack Kelly from Peace Action is going to jump in here and close things out and talk a little bit about actions people can take and what's next. Hey there, Jack Kelly, how are you?
Hi, Jerome. How are you doing?
Excellent.
Interesting conversation. And do you like me to go in and cover a couple of things here, or?
Sure.
Okay. First of all, Stan, I wanted to congratulate you and thank you for your discussion. You clearly lay out some very difficult and complex solutions that we must take into account as we go through this planning process. And so for that, I congratulate you. I read your book and I've taken a lot of notes here this evening, and will require a lot of additional dialogue, not only among ourselves, but in our conversations with our political leaders in the process. And Jerome, I thought you did a great job in your conversation and as the moderator this evening. I was particularly impressed with the deluge of questions you were able to handle in a very short period of time as you were kind of taking them off of the Q&A. So congratulations on that. And we are now, believe it or not, here we are ready to, at this long last, to take on the task of how do we transition away from fossil fuels. Obviously, the difficulty as well as the tasks ahead of us are going to be complex. The compounding problem is we really have a limited amount of time that we need to address this issue. As Greta Thunberg has said, we must come to the realization that we're in a crisis and we must act, and in our actions behave and handle that crisis and handle it as a climate emergency. So what we need to do is and I'm just looking at what we need to do, obviously, is as we go forward, to determine how do we work together. And what we have done here at CAPA, and we're working with 11 other organizations, environmental organizations, come together, all of whom are in one form or another addressing this issue. And what we are looking at as we are standing here is that we need to make sure that we are at that difficult time that we're able to handle. We're not to the point after coming through this pandemic to the point where we can start our in live person meetings at this point in time. So what I am looking at and saying, how do we handle something like this? Well, this evening we've handled a meeting. We had 168, 170 people sign up, of which individual people would be signed up. I believe maybe in 20 or 25%, maybe two people were working off of the same computer. So that's a very sizable number. And what we want to do is look as we go forward. And what I'd like to do is ask and make a plea to all of the folks that are listening this evening to see what we can do to ask for your financial support as we go forward. All of the 11 organizations that we're working with will need the same financial support. So what I'm asking you to do is not to just support CAPA, but to look to the organization that you are currently a member of and say, can I, in some manner, help you continue to do this work? We're going to be expecting on a national basis a lot of initiatives that will be coming forward. We're going to be having a lot of dialogue with our political leaders in the process. We're in the process of doing something very similar here in Illinois, and we've been working on that. And Jerome has talked about some temporary halts in that, but we do expect to have some major initiatives coming our way in a very short period of time. So what I'm suggesting this evening is that you look at the organization that you belong to, go to their website, touch on donate, and make a $25 or $50 or $100 donation, whatever you can afford. And in the process, what we'll all be doing, we'll be working together as we take on a very complex and a very, very important position. So what I'd like to do is thank you all for coming, and thank you for a very interesting and very difficult conversation, because what we have not looked at before are a lot of the issues that you have raised, Stan. And what we need to do is go forward together, is wish you the best of luck, wish you all an enjoyable evening, and from all of us over here, we'd like to sign off and thank you for joining us. See you soon.